Hello and welcome to the Bangladesh and the World podcast, brought to you by the Bangladesh America Alliance. Please be sure to follow us on social media such as Twitter or X, Facebook, and LinkedIn, and subscribe to our YouTube channel, all under the BD-US Alliance or keyword search Bangladesh America Alliance. I'm Dr. Farhana Sultana, professor at Syracuse University and co-chair of the Bangladesh America Alliance, and I'd like to welcome you all today. We have a special episode today, and we have two very special guests joining us. Our focus will be a recent congressional briefing, an event we held on Capitol Hill, organized on the first anniversary of the July Revolution in Bangladesh. But first, let me give you some background on this before I move on to introducing our esteemed guests and proceeding in our discussion. Next slide, please. So I'm going to just talk about what we did in our DC event. So on July 15th, a congressional briefing was held on Capitol Hill in Washington, D.C., under the title, The Journey Towards Justice, Reform, and Democracy, Bangladesh Today, 1 year after the July Revolution. Organized by the Bangladesh America Alliance, Right to Freedom, and Bangladesh Research, Analysis, and Information Network, or BRAIN, the event brought together policymakers, members of Congress, their staffers, as well as scholars, Bangladesh diaspora members, civil society, and media to reflect on the ongoing transformations in Bangladesh and to describe and discuss what lies ahead. The event marked the first formal congressional level engagement on post-revolution Bangladesh in the last year. In the face of earlier silence relatively and a lot of misinformation, the event created a platform to voice the concerns of those who continue to fight for accountability, justice, and democratic reform. It was significant that many of the speakers were independent scholars, analysts, advocates, not party-affiliated representatives, but those who underscored the importance of diverse perspectives and a principled commitment to democracy, human rights, and accountability. Next slide, please. Next slide, please, Samia. Thank you. So the event was sponsored by Congressman Lloyd Doggett, Democrat from Texas, who delivered a powerful keynote speech addressing the authoritarian legacy of the former regime of the Awami League, emphasizing the need for sustained democratic support in South Asia. Congressman Jim McGovern, Democrat from Massachusetts, who is also a co-chair of the Tom Lantos Human Rights Commission, reiterated the importance of human rights and U.S. foreign policy that centers justice and dignity. Next slide, please. Here you can see photos of us giving the famous book, The Art of Triumph, about the student-led Bangladesh Revolution to Congressmen Doggett and McGovern as token gifts to commemorate the event. Next slide, please. So one of our guests, Don Danielowicz, who is the president of the Right to Freedom, opened the event with highlighting the historical significance of the July 2024 revolution and the critical path forward. As co-chair of the Bangladesh America Alliance, I delivered opening remarks about the panels that followed to reflect the revolution's continued reverberations and the aims of the seminar, which was to create space for honest, critical, and independent dialogue. Next slide, please. The two panels captured the depth of the current moment and the stakes ahead. The first, which was titled Lessons from the July Uprising, was moderated by me and featured Aruni Semonti Khan from Jagannath University, Catherine Cooper from RFK Human Rights, and Dina Siddiqui from New York University. The panel reflected on the revolution as a mass multi-generational uprising rooted in decades of frustration. The panelists went on to explore the importance of community-based resistance, the roles of women and youth in driving change, and the risks of returning to authoritarian habits. So movements at the neighborhood, the factory, and campus levels matter as much as moments in parliament. The conversations range from transitional justice to economic precarity, the need for electoral reform, labor protections, and adherence to international human rights treaties and civic space were emphasized. One key thing that emerged was how we must remember it was youth unemployment that brought about the July Revolution, and it continues to threaten democratic futures. And this was all calling for importance of economic recovery, but also to fight erasure of collective memory. The second panel, which was called Bangladesh and the World, was moderated by Shamaruk Mohiuddin of the Cadmus Group and included retired Ambassador Dan Mozena, Michael Kugelman of Foreign Policy, one of our guests, Moushumi Khan of the Asia Group, and Ehtisham Haq of American University. The panel discussion focused on Bangladesh's shifting relations, especially the implications of deepening ties with China and how a recalibrated US foreign policy could play a constructive role. The panelists stressed the need for equitable economic relations and an end to extractive relationships and partnerships. While trade and investment are necessary, they must not come at the cost of civil liberties and human rights and labor rights. The geopolitical terrain has changed, but the fundamentals remain. International actors must engage with civil society, not just the ruling elites. Bangladesh's future will not be secured only through economic deals. It will depend on whether governance is reformed, whether rights are respected, and whether youth are given real opportunities. What emerged across opening speeches, both the panels, and subsequent discussion that day was a sober yet hopeful vision that the revolution opened a political horizon that must not be foreclosed. The current interim government, led by Nobel Peace Laureate Dr. Muhammad Yunus, has raised expectations of reforms. Yet, as many panelists noted, and the discussions also highlighted, reform is not inevitable. It requires vigilance, organization, and meaningful support, especially from the international community. Next slide, please. So the audience was across the board. As I mentioned, the event was well attended. And what the event did was it reminded us that 1 year after the July Revolution in Bangladesh, the path ahead is still being shaped. The violence, sacrifice, and demands of the Bangladeshi people must not be forgotten or undermined. The event on Capitol Hill was an important step in amplifying these voices and reminding international actors that democracy in Bangladesh is not an abstract principle, but a lived, urgent, and unfinished struggle. So as we continue to mark this anniversary and honor those who sacrificed to bring it about, let us commit to keeping Bangladesh in our political imaginations, not only as a site of suffering, but as a space of possibility. Justice and reform will not come without pressure, and democracy will not flourish without solidarity. And the stakes remain high even today, but so does our resolve. So what I want to conclude with is by saying the media coverage of the event in Bangladesh was quite extensive that week. It was in print media and in television. And further outputs have emerged in the last month since the event was held in July, such as op-eds, other discussions, and also information sharing with US political and policymaking establishment who who have followed up to learn more about what is happening in Bangladesh. So now let me turn to our discussion. We can conclude our slideshow and turn to our speakers. I want to thank very fiercely our two speakers who were with us a month ago in Washington, D.C., but then also who are here to discuss what were the lessons learned, what are some of the key takeaways from our Capitol Hill event, but then further reflections on the situation in Bangladesh. So our first speaker is, or one of our speakers is John Danielowicz. Welcome, John. John is the president of the Right to Freedom, and he's also a retired former U.S. diplomat. Next, we have Moushumi Khan. Welcome, Moushumi. Moushumi was one of our panelists, and she is a senior advisor for the Asia Group and has worked extensively in Asia and also in Bangladesh. So I have some tentative prompts for our speakers today in a sort of discussion panel. And I want to be able to raise a range of issues, so please feel free to speak freely. So, let's first start. What were some of your key takeaways from our DC event? And, what do you think is the importance of commemorating the July Revolution via the specific format of engaging with U.S. policymakers and congressional staffers and congressmen, and let's hear what you guys have to say. John, do you want to take us away?
Sure. Thanks, Farhana and Moushumi. It's great to see you again. A couple things, leap out for me that, reflect what you've already said to some extent. I mean, the first is that despite being, as Ambassador Mozina pointed out, the 8th most populous country in the world, Bangladesh just doesn't receive the amount of attention it deserves in Washington. For a brief period of time in July and August 2024, the world's attention was focused on Bangladesh, but it quickly moved on to other things as the world continues to be a very tumultuous place. I think the opportunity to commemorate the anniversary gave us an opportunity to return to Bangladesh. But I hope that that doesn't mean that now the world and the United States and policymakers in Washington will forget about the country. So I think the role that organizations like ours, small volunteer-based organizations as we are, can do our part. My other takeaway also reflects the experience I had when I visited Dhaka soon after our event. I had the opportunity to go to Dhaka, participate in a conference on the July Revolution, and interact with a number of young people and others who were on the streets in July and August. And one message that came through loud and clear is that those who were on the front line struggling in Bangladesh were very well aware of what was being done around the world in support of their cause. The activities of the Bangladeshi diaspora and Friends of Bangladesh, whether it be in the United States or elsewhere, made a difference. And I think in two ways, particularly. First, it gave hope and I think some encouragement to those fighting for their freedom. And secondly, it presented the regime with a dilemma in that as much as they tried to crack down on what was happening in Bangladesh, cut off Bangladesh's communications with the world, to the extent that the world was paying attention, it complicated the regime's attempts to stop what was happening. So I think it shows that both during normal times and particularly during those times of crisis, it does matter what those of us around the world see and think and do.
And thanks, John. Moushumi?
Thank you so much, Farhana, for inviting me to participate. Great to see you, John. And for sure, you both have touched on the very excellent discussion we had recently, but also kind of the parameters of where it is and how we're moving forward. So I think I have a couple of points. To go back to the discussion, it was a very healthy, robust, but also constructive discussion of kind of how we got here, what the current mood and current situation is. And as John said, really illustrated the level of interest. I was heartened to see the congressional leaders, but also their staff who stayed on and really asked very good questions, engaged with us afterwards. So I think thanks to the efforts of many of you, the interest is certainly there and the importance was very much conveyed. I speak in my personal capacity because in the past I have represented the U.S. government. Here I'm here very much in my personal capacity, even just as a lawyer, as a Bangladeshi American. But one of the things that I wanted to also extend from that, if we look at kind of the spirit, certainly from the student activists, as you mentioned, we getting the passion, the history of how they ended up. It's really important to note that this is a time for strategic reset for Bangladesh. And what I mean by that is when you think about a strategic reset, it's not just, okay, what happened and how did we get here, but what are we looking for? And what are the expectations of who's in charge now? For me, I think the main takeaway is to have a really robust, constructive, and a very realistic conversation of what the expectations are appropriate to have for the interim government. And I say that because oftentimes, now that the initial year has passed, the initial kind of tension around how we got here, a lot of discussion, particularly I would say among the chattering classes, among the civil society, et cetera, is what the IG has or has not done. I'm certainly not here to defend the interim government. I'm not part of the interim government. I know who the interim government is, as we all do, but I say that because I think we will waste a lot of energy kind of saying what they should not have done, but rather kind of thinking about what the role of kind of a proactive approach to get on a long-standing kind of changes. So I think managing expectations and aligning expectations of both Bangladeshi Americans, the other anybody who cares about Bangladesh, civil society leaders, people like John, others, and certainly the US and other countries, whether it's vis-a-vis trade or tariffs or just kind of geopolitical relations, regional politics. And then I think, for this initial discussion, I think the role of the government itself, as we said, aligning the expectations of this particular government here on, but also the private sector. And I will end by saying the role of multilateral development banks, but also international organizations. I know these are things I touched when we spoke, but they really bear repeating because of the importance as we move forward and have a proactive approach. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Moushumi. Thank you, John. Those are quite comprehensive issues that were all touched upon in the event on Capitol Hill. One of the things that I think was really important for the event that both of you alluded to is the fact that, year on, some interests have remained, some interests have fallen away, but at the same time, revisiting it and reigniting that interest amongst, people who might have a say or an influence over, these kinds of policy level decisions, but also in terms of like the diaspora. And recognizing that it's very easy to forget. There's that, erasure of collective memory can be happening over time. But, the young activists who led this, like 1,400 of them were massacred in the space of 3 weeks. Thousands, tens of thousands were injured, many critically so, many remain struggling with their health. And that a future built on this means that we need to celebrate and come back to that collective resistance that was there, but that is fragmenting. It happens over all kinds of revolutions or revolts. The other thing that I think for me was an important key takeaway was what you mentioned, Moushumi, in terms of the attention and the people who are present, including congressional staffers, the diaspora, but also private sector. There are plenty of private sector folks who are present, who are paying attention. But as John mentioned, people in Bangladesh are continuing to be quite aware of the role of actors elsewhere. So I think these kinds of events help us re-anchor to come back to what was said and done, but also to recognize that what happened was a refusal of an entire generation to accept the normalization of brutality. So, whether we can continue to honor and respect that and make sure that that kind of authoritarian backslide doesn't happen, those are things to be mindful of. And yes, international institutions play an important role, as does civic society, and also just private citizens, everyday people, and the diaspora. So I want to also then, just briefly touch on what can we think about now that we're we've entered a year on that, the interim government was, brought into place on August 8th. So it's just been a little over a year. And as we've entered the second year since the July Revolution, the lessons learned over the past year, like in terms of some of the issues that we've learned, we've talked about how we got there, what our event was about, the issues that we discussed, why it's important to remember this, and why these kinds of events are important. But I think one thing, that we can, and I'll start this off, like, over this past year, one thing that I believe that we've learned is that it gives us a way to reset, what you were mentioning, Moushumi, in terms of democratic values, mutual respect, but with other countries, external partners, and specifically in foreign relations. So not having India as an intermediary. And so, especially in Bangladesh's relationship with the United States, which has been long, but, complicated. So I believe maybe over the past years, there's been a loss of interest, as John mentioned, but people are beginning to more substantively engage over this past year and thinking about bilateral relations, multilateral relations, in terms of economic partnerships, American businesses and agencies, investing, the investment opportunities being created in Bangladesh, the diaspora pushing for reform, including, absentee votes from abroad for Bangladeshi citizens, but, to recognize that the diaspora are not simply remittance senders or occasional voters, right, when they're in country, but that they're, people who are advocates for the country, and they're engaged deeply in what happens, and in terms of being citizens of conscience. So this was the robust discussion we did have in DC, and we can continue to raise awareness. And I think this is something that was really brought to the fore over this past year, that there's a role for much more ethical and conscionable approach. Even people who are not politically engaged and motivated in the past became so a year ago, right? And they started to speak up against injustice more and more. So, let me start with you this time, Moushumi. What do you think? What have we sort of learned over this past year?
Again, very good summary. Thank you. And I was remiss not to thank the organizers of the event. Originally I thought it was very well done. Thank you to all the organizers. When I reflect back on kind of what has happened and, what have we learned, I am reminded of the student, Arnie, and I know I mentioned her earlier, but I want to go back to that. And the reason I want to go back to that is, if we remember why they started this, I myself had to remind myself, in the sense that it wasn't that suddenly they decided to get rid of a leader they didn't like. I lived in Bangladesh from 2010 to 2020, certainly at the peak of kind of the, of the regime. But what I was struck by is a very, very narrowly focused issue. It was an economic issue. It was a right to jobs, and it was a right to feeling a sense of unfairness, and then pushing back. And when things just finally, when their back was against the wall, I watched, there's so many documentaries that have been put out, but the one documentary line that really stands out in my head, and to your point, a young student asked one of the military leaders, sir, don't you see what's happening? Can't you do something about it? And it was this kind of earnest plea. And it wasn't like they were out there just to, wreak havoc, or, break things, or, do this kind of political or any kind of violence. I say that because I think the narrative, and many of you on this, and certainly I am, I'm someone who cares about Bangladesh. My ethnicity is Bangladeshi, but it's not something that I spend a lot of time on, but it is something that I certainly am interested in. So I was very struck by how so much of what has happened in Bangladesh, as you said, has been through the lens of, reaction to a trade policy, reaction to a tariff, reaction to a geopolitical partner, and when by this revolution happening, it kind of tore away that veneer to say, you know what? Bangladesh stands alone based on these issues, starting with economics. If you look at Martin Luther King, the last march he did was for the sanitation workers, right? And so this issue of economic justice is an issue that is across the world. It's not just in Bangladesh or in the US or any country. And I think for me, just to bring that back to what the focus should be now, I've said a lot about what the expectations for the interim government should be. I think a very reasonable expectation is to put in the process for an enabling environment for political and for actually the private sector to kind of help lead, but to put in good customs reforms, help to put in tax reforms, improve the ports. That's a tall order, but some of these hard reforms, I mentioned this, recently when I spoke at something else, those hard reforms, if it's taken by a non-political government, the next political government can actually benefit from that. And so I think my word of caution is many people who are saying, let's have elections immediately, their entire focus is on elections without really looking at how much has been achieved. And I would also like to, sorry for taking some of your time, John, but I do want to say one important point is that let's go back to the tariff negotiations that just happened. I think that'll sum up kind of what I've been trying to say. One is, I think there are very low expectations. It was the sky is falling, Chicken Little, as well as, Bangladesh can only kind of react to this. And our biggest exporter, our biggest industry is going to fall apart because these neophytes, or because of whatever reason, I don't want to cast any aspersions, but, that we don't know what we're doing. We need to save this industry. And first of all, it is without a doubt that the interim government did an excellent job of actually negotiating, understanding the interests of the U.S., understanding that it is an uncertain, sometimes incoherent, and often unclear where this is going. But they focus on what the interests of the Bangladeshis and the long-term economy is. So I want to applaud the interim government for that, for sure. But the second point is, it was also very proactive. It wasn't reactionary. It's like really focusing on regional partnerships, regional economics, and focusing on diversifying the economy. That's going to set us in good stead. So I know I went way over what you asked, but I did want to make those 3 big points. So thank you.
Thank you, Moushumi. John?
Actually, it's great going third because you guys get the main points and it gives me time to think. So appreciate it. First, at the risk of being obvious, I'm a former U.S. diplomat. Like Moushumi, I no longer speak for the U.S. government. I speak for myself. And again, to echo something Farhana said earlier, I'm also not here to defend the interim government. I mean, the interim government can defend itself. And as Moushumi pointed out, the interim government has a lot to point to in terms of successes. For those who question our event, they can watch the whole event, which is available online. So if you weren't able to come to Washington July 15th, the whole event is there for you to watch. In terms of the bigger picture and the question that you asked Farhana in terms of the interim government's performance and where we go from here, I've often reflected on the fact that this story is one that's a continuing story. And as I've said before, we've seen this movie play before. I mean, I've certainly seen this movie in the early 1990s following the end of the Ershad dictatorship. We saw this movie again in the 2007-8 caretaker period, and obviously since last July and August. So ultimately, I think the success or failure of this government won't be based on what the prices of essentials were during Ramadan. It'll be based on how much of this reform actually sticks. At the same time, the government has, I think, a responsibility and a clear demand from the people to begin the process of accountability for what's happened in the past. So these 2 issues, justice for the past and preparing the framework for the future, I think are the ultimate test by which this government will be judged. So in a way, we won't be able to pass judgment on this government until sometime in the future. So I would caution those who get too down into the weeds on the day-to-day of what the government is doing or not doing. And I think, from Professor Yunus's standpoint, he also has a very clear view of, the responsibility that he was given and the responsibility that he and his colleagues have to put in place the conditions that will help the next government be successful. I hope other governments or other parties and those who hope to form governments have been watching, not just events, but the reaction, because the interim government has come under criticism, rightly so in my view, for some of the steps that they've taken or things that they haven't done. So for me, the most important thing for this tenure of this government is the degree of openness, the willingness of people to criticize the government, whether it be at an event in Washington, D.C., or at events in Dhaka, in newspapers, on television, in social media. Again, it's not perfect, but I think there's a sense of openness now which didn't exist before. And to some extent, one of the tragedies of the 2009 to 24 period was the degree to which Bangladesh shut itself off from the rest of the world. And this was done often in very simple but effective ways. The government of Bangladesh just didn't issue visas to critics, to journalists, to academics, to human rights activists. One of the things that I think has changed for the better since last July and August is Bangladesh opening its doors, making it much easier for people to visit. Again, many of these same categories. Many members of the Bangladeshi diaspora as well had felt for a number of years they wouldn't be able to travel back home. And, it seems that the airlines are all full of people going back, whether it's to fulfill social obligations, to explore business opportunities, or to find ways to engage. So again, I think if you look back on this period, you can already see that there will be a number of positive developments that have taken place. And I think what was mentioned before, this idea of a reset, if nothing else, that was what Bangladesh achieved last July and August, that the path that the country was on, which was never going to end well, whether it ended last July or August, or whether it would have been months or years later with an economic collapse, the country was clearly headed in the wrong direction. Thanks to the sacrifices of students and others, Bangladesh was given this new opportunity. Professor Yunus and his team, I think, have done as much as they can, or as much as can be expected, to help move things in a positive direction. And certainly in the economic area, they've done tremendously, as has been pointed out. But ultimately, whether or not the dreams and aspirations and hopes of the people are fulfilled will depend on the next elected government, and then will depend on the ability of the Bangladeshi people to hold that government accountable.
Thank you, John. Thank you, Moushumi. You both have touched upon so many important things that this has been such a tumultuous year, right? Any government that steps in, whether caretaker, interim, or permanent, right after a post-fascist revolution, there's so much instability. There's so many institutional hurdles. There's so much embedded, especially in Bangladesh in this particular case, so much deep-seated institutional corruption, inefficiencies that were entrenched, problems in the judiciary, in the police force, in the legal frameworks, and so on. So that, as John pointed out, absolutely, there's only so much you can do within the context of what you've inherited, and also the situation, the volatility. But at the same time, this massive expectation to fix everything and fix everything quickly. Whereas there's like 15, 16 years of entrenched problems, that continue to sabotage, change and reform from within. And one thing that has continued that was really harmful has calmed down a little bit. But, the role that, India played in propping up the former regime, but then after the regime was overthrown, how it went into hyper action in terms of disinformation, including, the misinformation that it was giving to other countries, including the United States, and also what has continuing to happen in media, but then, in social media particularly, the continual debunking and rebuttal that is needing to take place, so that exactly the issues that Moushumi, you and John, you raised, can have proper representation to the global press, to the global audience, to global policymakers. And I think we've gotten better at this because people have realized that it's not worth paying attention to this disinformation industry, that it doesn't help anyone, and it's dying its last breath basically, but it's still there. So the next government will have to contend with that most likely, because currently it's not really going anywhere. And unfortunately, it's also happening internally, domestically. Now that there's that cohesion that was there a year ago, naturally will start to shift and morph into different party affiliations. So there's the inter-party competition and claims making and so on. So let me now turn to another issue that both of you touched on, and I touched on a little bit in the introduction slides, that let's turn to some of the kind of geopolitical, economic, and strategic challenges and windfalls. We talked about some of the challenges and some of the windfalls that Bangladesh faced this past year, but also what is Bangladesh likely to face going forward? But what do you think might change? Elections have been called for in February. Do you think that given the changes we've seen in geopolitical ties, economic, reputational, and and then the strategic, both challenges and benefits that have shifted in this last year and will likely continue to shift next year? But then there's the next regime coming in after elections, which is likely to be the Bangladesh Nationalist Party, the BNP, which was the largest opposition party while the former Army League regime was in power, and it's still the largest bloc, the largest political party in Bangladesh right now. So they're likely to come in. We're not sure entirely, what their politics is, and none of us speak for them, so we don't have the insider information. But what do you think might change because we're still going through these transitions a year later, right? And we'll continue to do so over the next 6 months. And then after elections, do you think there'll be drastic changes, perhaps, in the geopolitical, economic, and strategic landscapes before and after the elections? John, let me start with you.
Sure. So I think there's two aspects to this. The first is if you look at Bangladesh's interests, and I think Bangladesh's interests are largely determined by geography, economics, population, demography, environment, which I know, Farhana, you're an expert on. So these things aren't going to change. So they were the same considerations the last government had, the same considerations this government had, and the same considerations the next government. So to some extent, you'll see some continuity. For example, the need to balance the relationship with China with the relationship with other great powers. That won't change. But what I think is changing, and frankly, I think is a healthy debate, even though it's uncomfortable at times, is the question of Bangladesh's national identity. And this is something which I think has particularly been surprising to the extent to which it's the young people, the students, who have been the ones who focused on this. I recall a conversation I had with some of the student leaders back in March when Ambassador Milam and I visited. And we asked about how nationalism should be defined in a Bangladesh post July 2024. And we received a much more thoughtful answer than I had been anticipating. That these young people, again, even though they're young, they have a deep sense of Bangladesh's history, and they're struggling with this issue of identity. And again, as an outsider, I'll only ever be able to have a limited understanding of this. But the whole question of 1947, the questions of 1971, what it means to be Bengali, what it means to be a Muslim, what it means to be a Muslim Bengali, what it means to be a Bangladeshi, and how Bangladesh then defines itself both internally and with respect to the rest of the world. And some of these questions have been postponed. Earlier on in the transition process, there was a lot of talk about constitutional reform. That didn't happen. But you can see glimpses of this reflected in both the July Charter and the July Declaration, both of which the July Declaration was issued by Professor Yunus. The July Charter is in its final stage. And you can see glimpses of this. Ultimately, the next government and subsequent governments will have to determine how to move forward in terms of the Constitution, et cetera. But I think in many ways, this question of national identity is most important. And my final thing I would say is that as an American, I often have to remember that these phenomena that I think about in Bangladesh aren't unique to Bangladesh. In many ways, here in the United States, as both of you well know as well, we have our own struggles with national identity. What does it mean to be an American? As a descendant of immigrants, the whole question of immigration, for example, and the question of what it means for an American melting pot is something which is very much in the fore these days. As the debates take place in Bangladesh about Bangladesh's founding fathers and the relative importance that they should have and their achievements and their flaws, I often have to remind people that our own founding fathers had deep flaws as well as greatness, and that we as Americans have had to struggle with this. So I know it's uncomfortable for Bangladesh to talk about these issues and to talk about 1971 and to talk about people like Sheikh Mujib and Zia Rahman and others. But I think these are necessary conversations which haven't taken place before.
Thank you, John. Moushumi, do you want to add to that?
I'm not sure what I can add to that. It was pretty comprehensive, but just, I would echo the idea of kind of that, I don't know if it's soul searching, but, that national identity conversation, because that is already, that genie is out of the bag, in the sense that, it precipitated a lot of the current struggles, but also kind of future looking. I just have 2 or 3, cautionary caveats, is that I do think that the next government, whether they like it or not, there will be some level of need for reconciliation, maybe a truth and justice kind of commission to kind of look at what's happened, because the appetite and really, frankly, the deserved, need for some kind of accountability, but also kind of an addressing, not just accountability, meaning, who did what and what do you do with them, but really coming together again. I know I was born, during that war in 71, and it is, the pain of it still is relevant. At the same time, we need to be able to come back together as a cohesive country, both in this country. I'm about to, leave for a community meeting here in my hometown to talk about what it means, what our local politics means, right? Same thing, as an American, that's important for our identity. As a Bangladeshi, Bangladeshis and Bangladeshi Americans, we can only reflect on what that means for not just a young generation. So number one is a kind of a reconciliation that, I don't know what you'll call it in the context of Bangladesh. That's for Bangladeshis to decide, but I do think that's something that needs to happen. Number two is I would very much caution against a looking backwards. In my estimation, I think we need to look forward. It is a reset. It's an opportunity. A lot of blood and has been shed. A lot of goodwill is now there in Bangladesh's corner to say, how do we move forward from an economic perspective, rather than reacting how something might affect one particular industry or not. And then the third thing for me very clearly is, I think that in terms of kind of looking at Bangladesh, as we listen, and I would accuse myself of this as much as anyone else, I really caution that we listen to the right voices, but all the voices. So for example, when I go to Bangladesh, I'm extremely heartened to hear from the driver or from the people who in my parents' home village, or kind of that there's a distinct, and I'm seeing this more and more, and this is why I wanted to bring it up, is there's a distinct kind of a difference between what leaders and policymakers or the intelligentsia or civil society or the chattering classes, as I said earlier, think and say, and really put out there very vociferously, and what the average person is feeling. And I think that bridge has to be made. And God forbid that we just replace one with the other. Those are my 3 big points. Thank you.
Thank you, Moushumi. And it's such excellent and important points both of you raised, in terms of both looking back, but also looking forward, and recognizing those interconnections between these challenges, also in terms of thinking about identity. And I think this is an ongoing hot debate in Bangladesh right now, and it will likely continue. Part of it is also wrapped up in both, political ideology, religiosity, a whole bunch of things, right? So when we think about the ongoing and likely challenges, going back to what John alluded to, that yes, there's a lot of issues beyond the economic and geopolitical or political internally, but things like increasing climate change impacts. In my work, which has been for decades in Bangladesh on water and climate change and land and social justice, these are real issues, and this is causing, driving issues around poverty and precarity with water access, water availability, but then also in terms of, land and in terms of equity in policy and equity in terms of property ownership, in terms of, distribution of welfare or well-being. How do we define well-being? So that, even the Bangladesh is trying to, or has, or is in the process of graduating from, least developed country to the next stage up in terms of like middle or lower middle developing country. We need to remember people who are still struggling and people who are made more precarious through these kinds of changes, which are often beyond their control. And then the ones that are within human control, I think we need to therefore do more. And that is entirely issues around economics and housing and labor justice and gender, but then also in terms of respect of different types of people, including our tribal and indigenous population, including immigrants inside Bangladesh, people who've been abandoned during the partition or during 71. So there's, these are all kinds of ongoing internal conflicts that no particular one government is going to solve. But I think these are issues that the next incoming government should pay attention to in terms of recognizing that there's a wide, palette of problems, but at the same time, there's a absolute demonstration of people's resilience, but also ability to come together. And right now, people will not stand for oppression and fascism the way they were conditioned to, or held, disappeared, or, politically brutalized, or economically, sanctioned in oppressing the former regime. I don't think people will tolerate the next regime coming in, behaving in similar ways. I think that has shifted. So I want to, start to conclude our podcast. But the last question that I have for both of you is, what gives you hope for Bangladesh? Moushumi, I'm going to go to you this time. What gives you hope for Bangladesh, as concluding thoughts?
Everything. I mean, and I mean that seriously, because even the negativity or the kind of the chaos and all the thing, of Bangladesh and Dhaka every day, it gives me energy. It makes me happy that people are so engaged. But I wanted to also take an opportunity to touch on a couple of things that you said. As usual, I love how you bring all our points together and really add a different lens to it. Thank you so much for bringing up the environment. Thank you so much for bringing up water, and also the importance of regional connectivity. For example, from a multilateral perspective, there's been a lot of emphasis on how to bring, transport and regional kind of cooperation, because that's really where the focus should be, and the environment. And I also want to say something perhaps that won't be popular, but I have to speak to conscience, and something that I'm trying to hold myself to account to is to speak some hard truths and just realize that life is much more nuanced and not black and white. The previous government actually did an excellent job with the environment. And I have to say that. And the reason I say that, particularly in the context of what you're saying, is that there's often a false dichotomy of the economy versus the environment. And regardless, Bangladesh, I won't even say any regime or anything, Bangladesh cannot afford to make choices, because in Bangladesh's context, it's inherent. And as scholars like you who have been studying water for decades, so, and understand the environment, you can teach me how do we kind of look at those issues. Certainly, we made bad, I won't say we because I wasn't involved, but, Bangladesh has a lot to improve on how we make some of those decisions. And that certainly has had a political lens, right? And so I won't speculate on that. But what I am appreciating is that, economics and environment, these are not zero-sum games, not even for one country. It's in a cohesion kind of anything that happens. If COVID didn't do anything, it taught us what happens in one place affects everybody. And so I think for me, the concluding remark is I'm filled with optimism. And I'm filled with, first of all, I'm an optimistic person, but I'm filled with optimism because even the stress and the sacrifice of people and kids and, of institutions breaking apart, I see that as an opportunity. Okay. When something breaks in my house, I'm very upset. Then I said, okay, thank goodness. Now I don't have to decide if I'm going to keep it or not because it's broken. So you move on and get something new, or you don't, you live without it. And my last, optimism is I love Bengali culture. I love Bangladesh. The fact that we are we celebrate different cultures and we look at our history. I think that's something to be celebrated. That's something to fall back on. And that's something that is inherent in Bangladeshi DNA. And that's something that we should really celebrate as we move on. So all positive, mostly moving forward. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Moushumi. John, what gives you hope for Bangladesh?
So when I was in Dhaka as our deputy chief of mission at the embassy, my boss was Ambassador Dan Mozina. So having worked with Dan for 2 years, I can't help but be optimistic. So I share Mo's sense of optimism. For me, though, it's very specific. It's related to these young people, this Gen Z. And I think there's a risk in how people are looking at Gen Z. It would be a mistake, in my view, to uh, assess the relevance or the importance or the contribution going forward of this generation by how well the National Citizens Party does in the next elections. Whether they win 0 seats or whether they win multiple seats, that's only one piece of the puzzle. I think what's more important is what this cohort in general contributes to Bangladesh over time. Even last year when the revolution was taking place, I reflected again on US history and the greatest generation that stormed the beaches, Omaha Beach and Normandy in 1944. For many of them, that remained the most significant thing they did in their entire lives, no matter what else they accomplished, no matter how long they lived. And I have a sense that, it was very similar for those who participated in the Liberation War in 1971. And it will be the same for the generation that was on the streets last year. And with due respect to those in political parties who struggled for years against the previous regime, the revolution of 2024 would not have happened without these young people. So I think rather than see these individuals as a threat, they should be seen as an asset for the entire country, whether it be in politics, whether it be in business, whether it be in academia, in civil society, in the professions. Whatever these young people decide to do, they will do great things. And Bangladesh's demographic advantage is that there are these young people, not just the ones we know, just not the ones in urban areas, but those in rural areas as well. So as much of the rest of the world struggles with an aging population and we worry about demographic collapse, I think Bangladesh has this opportunity. So hopefully the country and political leadership will harness these young people. And from a selfish standpoint, from an American perspective, I think these young people are key to also the relationship between our two countries going forward. So I hope that the U.S. government and other organizations find ways to also engage with these young people. There are elders in Bangladesh who have accomplished great things in their life, but they no longer deserve the last word on every issue. So I think bringing in some of these younger voices, both young men and young women, is critically important.
Thank you so much, John. I want to say thank you both for articulating what gives me hope as well. Young people, people of different classes, genders, ethnicities, religions, coming together, challenging each other, being on the streets together, trying to form a government together, critiquing, engaging in collective dialogue. Those, whether it's the July revolution, or the Charter Commission going forward with the NCP or BNP, it doesn't matter. The fact is that Bangladesh has changed irrevocably. And yes, political parties matter because their rules, their regime matter. But I think what gives me hope is that we are going to be an optimistic country despite the forces of pessimism, because we are revolutionaries at heart. And I can say this as somebody who was born and raised on Dhaka University campus, which has been the birthplace of a lot of the kind of revolutionary impulses in Bangladesh, whether it's the 1952 language movement, part of the 1971 war, and also all the various campuses in the 2024 July Revolution. So that revolutionary spirit is intergenerational, it's, cross-sectoral, and we need to keep that alive and not let it be squashed out again. It should not come to a violent revolution to be able to challenge and critique and question our governments. Democracies thrive when there is that checks and balances and robust conversations. So my hope is that in the future, that is the kind of legacy of the July Revolution going forward. So with that, I want to thank both our esteemed speakers, John and Moushumi. Thank you so much for joining this podcast, but also for being so instructive in the July 15th Capitol Hill event in Washington, D.C. John and I, we co-organized it with our two volunteer organizations, and there was a third volunteer organization. So this podcast is being brought to you by the Bangladesh America Alliance, which was one of the three organizations that put together one of the first post-revolution events on Capitol Hill in order to inform policymakers, the media, citizenry, and wider diaspora the importance of ongoing political, geopolitical, economic, cultural, and environmental ties across different countries with Bangladesh. So I invite you all to watch this podcast in the future, share it with other folks, check out our other podcasts from our YouTube channel, Bangladesh America Alliance, and also follow us on our social media on Twitter or X, and Facebook and LinkedIn. Thank you again to our speakers, and hopefully we will see you again next time. Goodbye.